Hey everyone, it's Dr. Antonelli, and we are here to discuss our last topic, topic 10 in educational psychology. It will be done in a number of parts, so this will be part one. Let's talk a little bit about some of the big ideas related to this chapter. And the first one is to remember that assessments that you utilize in your classrooms really serve a variety of purposes. There isn't just one reason that we give an assessment, such as a grade. We're looking for different things from that assessment and showing student learning, showing student progress, a variety of things that really should come out of assessments. In addition, our classroom assessments need to really focus in on and have four characteristics known as RSVP. We will talk a little bit about those in, I believe, the second part to this series. And we also need to talk about informal versus formal assessments. Informal assessments are things where teachers look at students' kind of verbal and nonverbal behavior so that they can see a pattern of things over time, which would be very helpful for teachers to, again, judge where they need to go with their lessons and things that students need additional help with. Formal classroom assessments are more these things that are planned. They're your weekly test on a Friday, your project or your homework that you actually plan out and have students complete, okay? Additional big ideas is that final class grades that we do give to students really only give us a very little bit of information about how students are achieving and what they're learning. It's much better to include lots of different things to show progress over time, to show student learning from point A to point B. That's really the bigger idea behind assessment. And then finally, standardized tests that are given to many students over the course of a school year can be helpful in certain ways. It can show us kind of achievement levels of the students in that school or that class and in certain areas. But again, the big idea takeaway here is not to use a single test score to kind of make super duper important decisions for students, okay? So moving on to the case study in this chapter. The case study really kind of looks at a 9-year-old student named Akeem, and he's in 3rd grade, and he has kind of weak skills in reading, writing, and math. And when he's asked to do tasks in those areas, he gets very agitated and disruptive. However, when we ask him to do things that he actually has an interest in, such as drawing or building things or using Legos, his kind of persona and behavior changes dramatically, and he actually works at tasks that he wants to do. So in this particular case study, the teacher actually finds ways to work with Akeem and his interests and lets him do things through portfolios and development of his ideas as a way to assess him. And that seems to work a lot better. So while he still has taken tests that have had low scores, the teacher was able to work with various kinds of assessments to really show the kinds of things that he is good at and things that he is working and making progress, even in the areas of reading, writing, and math, because she assesses him through his interests, things like building through Legos and things like that. So it's a great case study to read about. And again, this was a question about particular forms of assessment and what purposes they might serve. Akeem's achievements are included in her in-class assignments, which are formal assessments, ongoing observations, which are informal. There's a portfolio that Akeem creates for Ms. Gordon, and that's more formal. And then the achievement test that all students are required to take is more formal. And then, of course, always final report card grades that teachers are required to give, also a formal aspect. So let's take a look quick at what actually assessment is. Assessment, by definition, is kind of a process. It's not a one end-all thing. Think of it as an ongoing thing where we observe something, whether it's a student's behavior and what they're doing, and we kind of infer from that how much they know about something in a content area. That's really the definition of an assessment. There's two kinds of activities related to assessment: measurement and evaluation. Measurement is kind of collecting information about how much students have learned, and evaluation is kind of taking that collection of information and making a judgment on it. At what level is it that they actually know this information, or what level are they actually able to do a certain skill. Why should or do we need to assess, and what are the purposes of assessment? Well, it helps teachers guide what they're actually going to do in the classroom, instructionally and with their lessons. It can help teachers and other staff, child study team members, to diagnose learning and performance problems by looking at how a student performs on a test or an assessment of some sort. It helps to determine what students have already learned, so the teacher knows, again, back up to the first one, what to do in their lesson planning. It helps to evaluate and improve how good of an instructional model and lesson that a teacher is doing. And it promotes learning and increases student achievement. These are all good purposes for improving student achievement and for doing the best thing we can as teachers for students. In addition, assessments can promote learning by influencing motivation. And of course, if the assessments are things students can find an interest in, it will influence motivation in a positive way. Sometimes assessments have the reverse effect, where they influence motivation in a negative way. Obviously, we want to make sure that they influence motivation in a positive way as much as we can. In addition, assessments can promote a student using their cognitive processes as they study. Remember, metacognition was thinking about thinking. So are we, through the use of assessments, are students kind of practicing these processes, transferring information, using skills for problem solving and critical thinking throughout the assessment? It's almost like a practice for them. So the assessment itself, piggybacking on that, can be a learning experience for students, as well as, let's say, a classroom lesson where they do work inside the classroom. The test itself, or the assessment itself, whatever that assessment might be, could also be a learning experience. It provides feedback to students about their learning progress, where they were 2 weeks ago and where they are now, if it's something they've been working on and they see improvement, also a great thing, which would then, of course, influence their motivation, and encourages intrinsic motivation and keeping a student self-regulated if they're actively, seeing the purpose of assessments themselves and using the results to improve on what they're doing, okay? There are two kinds of assessments to remember: informal and formal. Informal assessments is where teachers kind of just spontaneously observe students. So during a lesson, for example, teacher may walk around, may look at what the students have written down on their papers, may listen to their the student answer questions, and this is done on a daily basis, okay? And then there's formal assessments that are very pre-planned and systematic. These are the kinds of things like tests and projects, homework, those kinds of things would be considered formal assessments. Informal assessments are very helpful because they provide feedback, providing feedback about how effective the instruction a teacher is utilizing, the tasks, the lessons, the activities the teacher is asking of the students. How effective are those things based on what the teacher is seeing in the classroom informally? And then they're helpful in that we can easily adjust as a teacher within the classroom. That's our flexibility piece, where if we see that something's not working because we're asking questions, let's say, and students cannot answer those questions during a lesson, then we know, okay, I need to go back, I need to readjust what I'm doing, I need to reteach it in a different way. Maybe something got missed in a step, so I need to go back. That's informal assessments are very helpful in that realm, okay? In addition, they either give us information to either support or question actually a more formal assessment. So when we're utilizing informal assessments in class, we can decide that, okay, we want to focus our formal assessment more in the area of essays versus multiple choice, because the material just is better used in that way. And that we'll be able to figure that out through our informal assessments. And then it helps us as teachers better understand some of the other factors that come into play with how well students do in the classroom. Things like social factors, emotional factors going on individually with students, or their motivation as well. Some tips for teachers. who are using informal assessments, which should be all teachers in classrooms, is to look at both verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Remember, nonverbal behaviors are body language, eye contact, things that we can get a sense of if students are, learning the material, are comfortable with the material just by their nonverbal behaviors. Are they fidgeting? Are they moving around a lot? Maybe their interest level is low, those kinds of things. And we can observe that nonverbally. Teacher should ask himself or herself whether what they are expecting from students kind of might be biasing what I'm judging when I am assessing. So if I have an expectation that all the students will do well for whatever reason I have that bias, is that really kind of clouding my judgment a bit or not? Okay, so when you're using an informal assessment, kind of think about that. Also, maybe write some things down. While we hope we all have good memories, sometimes our memory might fail us. So it's best to kind of keep written observations of students and what they're doing in the informal assessments in the classroom so that we can then put it all together. And then as a result, using those observations that we've written down, we can look for a pattern over time instead of just saying, okay, on Monday, I'm going to just observe this student and only on Monday informally. I'm not going to do any other informal assessments. That's usually not as effective. Taking all of those informal things we've assessed and kind of analyzing them, then that should help us to design some formal assessments that are very effective. Effective formal assessments are ones where students are learning from them, it's preserving their well-being, and it's maintaining the right to privacy when it comes to the grade and only having individual students know their own grades. That's what we mean by right to privacy. Make sure that any evaluation criteria that you are using is valid for what you're using it for. Meaning, is it the right way to score whatever you're asking them to do? Is it the way you've attached points to certain questions, more points to other questions? How is it actually guiding, the scoring that you're doing? Be as objective as possible in your scoring and your grading of formal assessments. The more objective, obviously, the better feedback for students and the more effective that assessment is. Continue to look at and make notes of how a student performs in a certain way that may be a rubric that you use, and we'll talk later about rubrics. What other things are coming into play? Okay, so you may have to really note that when you're looking at the grades on your formal assessments. And then a big part of this is evaluating and asking students how to evaluate their own performance, asking them, how well did you think you did? And why? Those kinds of questions, very important. When determining an overall score, never compare one student to another, unless there's a real good reason to do that. Always give constructive and very, very detailed specific feedback. Allow students to take some risks on maybe some of the questions on the assessment, something that makes them think outside the box, and always remember that students have or could be having a bad day, which will be reflected in their grade, especially if over time they've made progress, but then it looks like on the test they didn't score that well. And then respect their right to privacy, and what that means is in reference to when you post or announce grades, it should be, again, student receiving their score back privately and not in front of the entire class. The last two pieces is what we mean by assessment of versus assessment for. Assessment for has to do with formative assessment, which is before and during. And this is like before a lesson and during a lesson, where we identify what students already know, what are their strengths, what are their interests, what they think they know already about some new material we're going to cover, how they're progressing in how well they are understanding the material or not. This is all done during a lesson. And all of this information we gather as a teacher to plan for how we're going to instruct and enhance their learning further. Okay, so this is that formative piece, happens before and during a lesson. After a lesson is when we do what we call summative assessment, and it's the assessment of learning, meaning what have students gained from that lesson. We're trying to determine that, if they've mastered the information, what final grade to give to them as a result of that, who could use some maybe advanced classes, who could use some additional help. And it's this summative assessment, which is usually a test at the end of a unit or a chapter or or week, let's say, is used to determine a student's final achievement related to any sort of particular topic. So again, all of these ideas that we've covered, ideas about assessment, of, summative, formative, formal, informal, all very important in the discussion of assessment. Okay, see you soon.